On a frozen night in Silver Creek, snow roared across the mountain road when Jack's headlights caught a haunting sight. Rex, a German shepherd, stood on her hind legs in the middle of the storm, her 1-month-old puppy trembling at her side. She was not blocking the road, she was begging for help. Jack stepped out into the blizzard, not knowing that by saving them, he was stepping into a story darker and more dangerous than he could imagine. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from, and let this story remind you that kindness still exists in our world. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the stories of silent heroes. Wishing you a peaceful day. The night had folded over Silver Creek like a heavy shroud of white, and the storm showed no mercy as it clawed down from the mountains and whipped across the narrow road that Jack Carter was driving along. He had been behind the wheel for over an hour, the wipers screeching back and forth but clearing almost nothing, the snow thick as wool, his headlights swallowed whole by the blizzard. Jack, a man of 42, lean and broad-shouldered with the weary composure of someone who had lived through wars, gripped the steering wheel firmly. His olive-green field jacket was tossed on the passenger seat, and his eyes, gray-blue under a mess of dark hair streaked with silver, never left the dim path ahead. He had seen battlefields where chaos was constant, yet there was something about this relentless storm that stirred a familiar tension in his chest, the kind of silence before something went terribly wrong. The road twisted upward, hugging the cliffside, the wind howling like distant voices trapped in the forest. Jack's old pickup groaned as tires struggled against the drifts piling higher by the minute. He knew every curve of this mountain road, but tonight it felt alien, erased and rewritten by the blizzard. He leaned forward, squinting, his breath fogging the glass as the heater failed to keep up with the cold. He muttered under his breath that he would be home soon, that the storm could snarl and bite, but it would not keep him out here longer than necessary. He had no idea that only a few bends ahead, his night was about to fracture into something he could not have imagined. Out of the curtain of snow, a sudden shape broke through, dark and startling. Jack slammed the brakes, his truck skidding slightly, and his heart thudded against his ribs as his headlights illuminated the figure. There, standing squarely in the middle of the road, was a German shepherd, a female, tall and lean with a sable coat of black and brown dusted white by the storm. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, her breath visible in bursts of steam, and then she did something that made Jack's breath catch. She rose onto her hind legs, planting her body upright as though pleading. At her side, almost pressed against her front legs, was a tiny puppy, no more than a month old, fur soft and dark like its mother's, shivering violently, its little paws sinking into the snow. For a long second, Jack sat frozen, the storm howling around him, headlights casting the dog and her pup in a surreal glow, like a painting caught between desperation and hope. The shepherd's amber eyes locked onto his, wide and shimmering with something beyond instinct. Jack had seen eyes like that before, in soldiers, in civilians caught in war zones, eyes that did not cry for themselves, but for another. The dog barked once, sharp, then lowered herself back to the ground, pacing 2 steps forward before glancing back toward the forest. She was not blocking his way, Jack realized, but begging him to follow. He switched off the engine, grabbed his coat, and stepped out into the biting wind. Snow cut across his face like knives, and his boots sank ankle-deep immediately, but he hardly noticed. He moved toward the shepherd, who held her ground, waiting. The puppy let out a thin whimper, its tiny body trembling uncontrollably. Jack knelt, scooped it gently into his arms, and felt the fragile warmth against his chest. It weighed almost nothing, and the thought of it being out here in the storm made his throat tighten. He looked at the shepherd again. She barked twice, sharp and clipped, then turned her head toward the shadowed line of trees. The message was unmistakable. Follow me. Jack knew enough about animals to understand the weight of this moment. This was no random encounter. The shepherd had sought him out, had braved the road and the headlights to stop him here. He nodded once, almost to himself, adjusted the puppy in his coat to shield it from the wind, and motioned toward the forest. "All right," he muttered, his voice rough against the storm. "Show me." The dog barked once in acknowledgement, then leapt into motion, her paws flinging snow behind her as she pushed against the gale. Jack tightened his coat, pulled the hood over his head, and followed into the darkness between the trees. The forest swallowed them quickly, the storm muffled but no less deadly. Branches creaked under the weight of snow, the ground uneven with hidden roots and ice. The shepherd moved with urgency, pausing every few strides to glance back, ears pricked, eyes flashing in the dim beam of Jack's flashlight. The puppy whimpered softly against his chest, its small body pressing tighter as if it too sensed the urgency. Jack's breath came in harsh bursts, his boots crunching with each step, but something deeper than exhaustion pushed him forward. There was no logic to it, only instinct. He knew the sound of a plea when he heard it, and tonight it had come through the voice of a dog. Snow fell heavier, flakes stinging his face, clinging to his beard. The shepherd barked again, sharp and urgent, then disappeared over a small ridge. Jack pushed himself harder, nearly stumbling as the ground sloped downward. He thought briefly of how reckless this was, chasing a dog into the woods at night, but the weight of the tiny creature in his arms silenced any hesitation. This was no longer about sense or reason. This was about saving something fragile before it was too late. He could feel the echo of past missions in his chest, the pull of duty that had never quite left him, even years after laying down his uniform. The shepherd reappeared ahead, standing still, waiting for him. She rose again onto her hind legs, paws raised, almost human in her desperation. Her eyes burned with urgency, and Jack felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. He had seen soldiers signal in silence, gestures meaning more than words, and this was the same language. He took another step forward, shifting the puppy higher in his coat, and nodded toward her. "I'm here," he whispered, though she could not understand the words. She barked once more, then dropped back to all fours and darted forward again. Jack followed without pause. His muscles ached, his lungs burned from the cold air, but he pressed on. The wind roared through the branches, bending trees until they groaned under the weight. Somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of rushing water broke through the storm, a reminder of how close they were to the ravines that cut through the mountain. He kept his eyes fixed on the shepherd, her dark shape a lifeline against the white chaos. Every few seconds she slowed, making sure he was close, then sprinted ahead again. Time stretched, the storm swallowing minutes whole. Jack's world narrowed to the weight of the puppy, the crunch of his boots, and the sight of Rex's form carving a path through the snow. He did not know what awaited them, did not know why this dog had chosen him of all people, but in the marrow of his bones he understood one thing clearly. He was not meant to turn away. Not tonight. Not when life itself had asked him to follow. At last, the shepherd slowed, her body tense, her ears swiveling. She turned to him, eyes glinting, then barked low, a sound threaded with both fear and determination. Jack halted, chest heaving, his breath clouding the air. He could feel the storm pressing closer, the darkness thick around them. Whatever lay ahead was hidden still, but it was waiting. He clutched the puppy tighter and glanced at the shepherd. "All right, girl," he murmured. "I'm with you." And together they pressed deeper into the storm, toward a truth Jack had yet to discover. The storm had thickened as Jack followed Rex deeper into the woods, snowflakes pelting down in endless sheets, the trees swaying under the weight of ice and wind. His boots crunched heavily against the frozen ground, each step dragging against the pull of exhaustion, but the urgency in Rex's movements forced him forward. The German shepherd cut through the blizzard with sure steps, her dark form vanishing and reappearing in the weak glow of his flashlight, her ears flicking, her tail stiff with tension. Against his chest, the tiny puppy whimpered, pressing closer into his coat, as if it too sensed the peril waiting in the dark. The forest around them felt less like wilderness and more like a battlefield, every sound sharp, every shadow carrying the weight of dread. Rex's bark pierced the storm suddenly, sharp and anguished, and she bolted toward the edge of a narrow ravine. Jack hurried after her, stumbling down the slope, snow collapsing beneath his boots in small avalanches. At the base of the ravine, caught beneath a splintered pine trunk, lay another puppy. Barely a month old, just like the one he carried, its sable and tan fur was plastered with ice, its body trembling with shallow breaths, eyes glazed with pain and fear. The sight tightened Jack's chest in an instant. He had seen wounded soldiers sprawled under rubble, their eyes wide with silent pleas. Now he was seeing it again, only this time in the fragile body of a pup too young to know anything but suffering. As he drew closer, the light of his flashlight caught something that made his stomach knot. Around the pup's small neck was a metal collar, crude but deliberate, a band that should never have been there. Embedded in the steel was a tiny device, a red light pulsing faintly against the snow, blinking like a sinister heartbeat. The metal had bitten into the soft skin of the puppy's neck, and a thin line of blood trickled from where it had already begun to cut deep. Jack crouched, his hand trembling not from cold but from fury. Whatever this was, it was not natural, and the cruelty of it stoked the soldier's instincts that still burned in him even after years of silence. Rex barked frantically, circling the trapped pup, her paws clawing at the snow as she whined in desperation. She darted back toward Jack, eyes blazing, then back to her pinned offspring, as though urging him to hurry. Jack pressed his lips together, assessing the scene quickly. The tree trunk was heavy, thicker than his thigh, and wedged tight into the snow. Alone, his strength would not be enough. He scanned the area, his gaze falling on a fallen branch, thick and sturdy, lying nearby. With practiced movement, he seized it, wedged it beneath the trunk, and braced himself. Muscles taut, he pushed downward, the weight of the tree groaning as it shifted ever so slightly. The ground trembled with the strain, snow sliding loose from the trunk as Rex joined in, her body throwing against the snow, paws scraping furiously at the packed ice. Her growls echoed through the ravine, guttural and primal, the sound of a mother fighting with everything she had left. Jack gritted his teeth, veins standing out on his neck as he leaned all his weight onto the makeshift lever. His boots slid, his back screamed with pain, but the trunk shifted a fraction more. In that sliver of space, he lunged forward, one arm bracing the branch, the other reaching under the heavy timber to grasp the trembling body of the pup. The puppy whimpered weakly, its body slick with snow and blood, its tiny legs kicking against the cold air. Jack pulled harder, the bark of the tree scraping against his gloves, until at last the pup slipped free from its prison. He fell backward into the snow with the puppy cradled in his arms, his chest heaving, sweat mixing with the frost on his skin. Rex barked in relief, rushing forward to lick her pup's face, whining frantically as if to assure herself that it was alive. Jack lay there for a moment, his breath ragged, staring at the broken little body he had just pulled from death's grip. The red light from the collar blinked steadily, an ominous pulse in the night. Jack's eyes narrowed as he sat up, the pup still trembling in his arms. His soldier's instincts screamed at him to act fast. He unsheathed the combat knife he always carried, its blade dull but serviceable, and pressed it carefully against the steel band. The puppy whined softly, too weak to resist, its breath shallow against his wrist. Jack worked quickly, slicing at the edges, sparks leaping faintly where steel met steel, until with one final push, the collar snapped free and clattered into the snow. The puppy let out a feeble cry, then relaxed slightly, as though some weight had been lifted from its tiny body. Jack turned the device over in his gloved hand, examining it in the dim light. The craftsmanship was crude, not something store-bought, but engineered with intent. The blinking light unnerved him, though its purpose remained unclear. What chilled him most was not its function, but the thought behind it. Someone had placed it deliberately on a helpless creature no older than 4 weeks, turning innocence into a tool. His jaw tightened, anger simmering beneath his skin. He had seen cruelty in many forms, but seeing it inflicted upon something so small felt like a new kind of brutality. He clenched his fist, forcing himself to push the thought aside for the moment. Survival came first. He sheathed the knife and pulled the puppy close, pressing its fragile body against the warmth of his chest beside its sibling. Both were trembling, one from fear, the other from injury, but together they seemed to draw a shred of comfort. Rex circled them, tail low, ears forward, her nose darting to sniff the pup as though memorizing the scent of life she had almost lost. Her eyes, dark amber in the snowlight, lifted to Jack's, brimming with a raw gratitude that needed no words. He nodded once, holding her gaze, silently promising that he would not let harm touch them again. The wind screamed through the ravine, carrying with it the sound of breaking branches and shifting ice. Jack rose slowly, the weight of the 2 puppies against his chest grounding him in the moment. He glanced at the broken collar lying in the snow, its red light still blinking faintly, half buried in the drift. For a heartbeat, he considered taking it, But his focus snapped back to the lives in his arms. They mattered more than evidence, more than questions. He turned away, adjusting his coat to shield the puppies from the cold, and looked at Rex. She barked once, quieter this time, and nudged his leg with her nose, ready to follow wherever he led. Jack tightened his grip, drawing a steady breath that misted in the frigid air. The mission, unspoken but undeniable, was clear. Get them to safety. Keep them alive. He cast one last glance at the shattered pine and the glowing collar beneath it, then began to climb the ravine, his boots sinking deep but steady. Rex trotted close by, her body pressed to his side, her eyes never leaving the puppies. The storm closed around them once again, but within that chaos, Jack carried fragile hope against his chest, the weight of 2 lives reminding him that even in the bleakest winter night, there was something still worth saving. The blizzard did not relent as Jack trudged back through the darkened woods, his body heavy with fatigue, but his arms cradling something far more fragile than his own strength. Pressed against his chest, wrapped tightly in the folds of his coat, were the 2 tiny German shepherd puppies, their breaths shallow but warm against him. At his side, Rex kept pace, her fur dusted with snow, her body taut with both exhaustion and determination, every step measured as though she was guarding her young with each stride. By the time the small shape of Jack's cabin appeared through the storm, its stone chimney exhaling faint smoke against the black sky, the man felt a surge of relief, tempered by the urgent need to keep the fragile lives in his arms alive through the night. The cabin was little more than a single-room shelter, built of rough-hewn logs and fieldstone, its roof groaning under the weight of snow. Jack shouldered open the door, the hinges squealing, and was met with the stillness of a cold interior, the faint scent of wood smoke lingering from the fire he had banked earlier in the day. He stepped inside quickly, closing the door against the shrieking wind, the storm muffled to a distant roar. The room was dim, shadows stretching across shelves lined with a few tools and books, and at its heart, the black iron stove sat waiting, surrounded by kindling stacked neatly beside it. He laid the puppies gently on a folded blanket near the hearth, their tiny bodies quivering as they whimpered softly. Rex padded in behind him, shaking snow from her coat before settling beside her pups, her amber eyes never leaving them, her chest rising and falling with a protective rhythm. Jack moved quickly, striking a match and coaxing the fire back to life, feeding it dry wood until flames leapt up, crackling bright and fierce, painting the room with flickering gold. The warmth spread slowly, thawing the air, and Jack's breath stopped fogging as he knelt beside the puppies. One lay weak, its body limp, the wound at its neck raw where the steel collar had bitten deep, while the other shivered with exhaustion, but clung to life with tiny, desperate movements. Jack reached into his old field kit, a canvas pouch worn thin from years of service, and pulled out bandages, antiseptic, and strips of cloth. With careful hands, he cleaned the blood from the injured pup's neck, wincing as he saw how close the steel had come to cutting deeper. The tiny creature whimpered, but Jack's voice was low and steady, murmuring words of comfort as though he were back on the battlefield, speaking to a wounded comrade. He wrapped the gauze gently around the pup's neck, tightening just enough to stop the bleeding, and pressed his palm against its chest until he felt the faint but steady thump of a heartbeat. He sighed softly, his breath shuddering, then glanced at Rex. She leaned down, licking her pup's head, her own body finally easing as though she trusted Jack to finish what she had begun. The second puppy, smaller but uninjured, pressed close against its sibling, drawing warmth from the blanket in the stove. Jack draped an extra wool cloth over them, shielding them from the drafts, then sat back against the rough wood of the cabin wall. His hands trembled slightly as he reached into his coat and pulled out the broken steel collar. In the firelight, it looked even more sinister. The band was thick and heavy, far too cruel for a creature so small, and the tiny blinking diode embedded in its side glowed faintly red, casting an eerie light across his palm. Jack turned it over, his eyes narrowing, and spotted delicate etchings of wiring and a chip nestled in the housing. This was not a collar meant for pets. It was a device built with purpose, and that realization sent a chill down his spine that no fire could chase away. He placed the collar on the table, the red light pulsing like a warning, and rubbed his hands over his face. The The storm rattled the windows, the wood creaking, but the sound barely touched him. His thoughts were fixed on the question that gnawed at his mind. Who would target a newborn pup? And for what? He had seen cruelty in war, had watched men turn to savagery in pursuit of power or control, but this was different. To take a creature of only a month old, helpless and innocent, and turn it into a pawn for some hidden design. It sickened him. His jaw tightened, and he forced himself to breathe, to focus on the fire crackling behind him and the fragile sound of life returning in the small bodies curled on the blanket. Rex shifted closer to her pups curling around them, her body a shield against the world. For the first time since he had seen her in the headlights, she seemed to relax, her breath steady, her eyes closing briefly as if she finally believed her mission was complete. Jack watched her in silence, respect etching itself into his expression. She was more than an animal. She was a mother, a protector, and tonight she had done what many humans would not dare. In her determination, he saw the reflection of soldiers he had once led, the unyielding spirit to fight for another's life, even at great cost. The fire burned bright, casting dancing shadows across the cabin, but Jack remained restless. His gaze drifted back to the steel collar, its light still blinking, a silent signal of something larger, something unseen. He thought of the puppy's fragile neck, of the blood that had stained his gloves, and felt a knot form in his chest. The questions pressed heavier with each passing moment. Why would anyone build such a device? Why attach it to a creature so young? And most of all, what did they intend to do with it? He clenched his fists, the memories of war pressing close, the sense of a battle yet unfinished rising within him. He rose slowly, pacing the length of the cabin, his boots thudding softly against the wooden floor. He glanced out the frost-covered window, the storm still, raging beyond, erasing all traces of the path that had led them here. He exhaled, long and heavy, then turned back to the fire. Rex lifted her head briefly, her eyes meeting his with a quiet understanding, before lowering it again to nuzzle her pups. Jack sat once more by the fire, his thoughts circling like wolves in the snow, restless and unresolved. The cabin was warmer now, the storm a muffled roar outside, and within its walls lay the fragile peace he had fought to create. Rex and her two pups slept at last, their breath steady, their tiny bodies safe for the first time in hours. Jack remained awake, staring into the flames, the steel collar still pulsing faintly on the table. He did not yet have answers, only the weight of questions that gnawed at him. But one truth had already rooted itself deep within him. Tonight had not been chance. Something dark had touched this mountain, and it had marked these helpless creatures. Jack Carter, weary veteran though he was, knew he could not ignore it. The fire in Jack's cabin had burned low by the time dawn broke over Silver Creek, the storm finally settling into a quiet hush, the world outside painted in sheets of white. Inside, the two puppies slept soundly, their tiny bodies curled together beneath a wool blanket. Rex stretched close beside them, with her eyes half closed, though her ears twitched at every sound, as if she refused to surrender fully to rest. Jack had not slept at all. He sat in his chair by the stove, his elbows on his knees, his gray-blue eyes fixed on the steel collar that still blinked faintly on the wooden table. He had handled many weapons in his life, but nothing unsettled him quite like this crude device wrapped around the neck of a newborn pup. As the first thin rays of daylight slipped through the frosted window, he knew what had to be done. By mid-morning, Jack had driven down the snow-packed road into town, Rex riding in the passenger seat with her head low, but her eyes alert. The puppies remained bundled in blankets back at the cabin, safe and warm, but Jack could feel Rex's tension humming like a wire. He parked in front of a small clinic near Main Street, the hand-painted sign above the door reading, Dr. Margaret Cole, Veterinary Services. Jack pushed through the glass door, the bell above it jingling softly. Inside, the warmth smelled faintly of antiseptic and hay, the shelves lined with medicine bottles and stacks of feed. Behind the counter stood Dr. Cole, a woman in her late 50s, sturdy and broad-shouldered, with gray hair tied into a bun and wire-rimmed glasses perched on her nose. Her brown eyes lit with recognition as Jack entered, though they quickly flicked toward Rex with professional concern. "Jack Carter," she said, her voice carrying the kind of steady calm that had soothed generations of farmers and ranchers. "You look like you've wrestled half the mountain. What brings you in?" Jack didn't waste time. He placed the collar on the counter, the faint red light blinking against the polished wood. Dr. Cole's brow furrowed as she picked it up with gloved hands, turning it slowly under the light. The weight of her silence pressed heavier than words. She moved into the back room, returning moments later with a handheld diagnostic scanner, a tool she typically used for microchips in livestock and pets. When she hovered it over the collar, the device beeped, its screen flashing in unfamiliar codes. "This isn't an ID tag," Dr. Cole murmured, her eyes narrowing. "There's a transmitter inside." And more than that. She adjusted the scanner, her fingers moving with practiced precision, then looked up at Jack. "This thing is sending a signal, a steady pulse on a controlled frequency. Not just tracking, Carter. It's designed to send and possibly receive commands." Jack's stomach tightened. He leaned closer, his jaw rigid, his mind flashing back to improvised devices overseas, radios used to trigger destruction. At the press of a button, he muttered, "That doesn't belong on a puppy's neck." Dr. Cole set the collar back down, her hands shaking slightly despite her steady demeanor. Whoever built this wasn't thinking about pets. This is engineered, purposeful, dangerous. Jack exhaled slowly, his breath rough in the sterile air. "I need this in the hands of the police," he said. Dr. Cole nodded firmly. "I'll call Sheriff Donnelly right now." She reached for the phone, her voice calm but clipped as she relayed the discovery. Within half an hour, the small clinic was filled with new footsteps. Sheriff Michael Donnelly, a man in his early 60s with a weathered face, thick mustache, and the solid build of someone who had spent his life in Montana's rugged country, entered with 2 deputies in tow. His navy parka was flecked with snow, and his eyes, blue but dulled by years of responsibility, landed on Jack with immediate recognition. "Carter," Donnelly said, giving a curt nod before turning to Dr. Cole. "You said it was urgent." She handed over the collar, explaining in brief the readings she had taken. Donnelly turned it over in his large hands, his jaw tightening as he caught sight of the blinking diode. One of the deputies, a younger man with sharp features and restless energy, produced a portable signal receiver from his pack. He flipped it on, listening as static filled the room. After a moment of tuning, he stiffened. "Sheriff, this frequency, it matches the ones flagged in the animal trafficking reports we got from the feds last month. Same range, same signature." The room grew colder despite the heat of the clinic. Dr. Cole removed her glasses, rubbing the bridge of her nose while Donnelly's face darkened. "So they're operating here too," he muttered. He looked at Jack. "There's been a string of missing dogs across the county, purebreds, strays, even working stock. We suspected a ring but had no proof, until now." He tapped the collar, his voice hardening. "This confirms it. They're not just stealing animals, they're experimenting with them." The younger deputy added, "Word is they've been fitting collars like these, using dogs for scouting, smuggling, maybe worse. They treat them like disposable tools." Jack felt heat rise through him, a slow surge that tightened his fists until his knuckles cracked. He looked at the collar, the small machine that had scarred the puppy's neck, and for a moment he saw it not as a device but as a mark of cruelty stamped onto innocence. His voice came low, edged with steel. "Rex didn't come to me by chance. She brought me those pups to save them, but also to expose this." His gray-blue eyes met Donnelly's with the quiet intensity of a soldier ready for orders. "This isn't just about 2 puppies. It's about stopping whoever's behind this." Rex, who had sat quietly at Jack's side, lifted her head as if she understood. Her amber eyes glowed in the light of the clinic, fixed on Jack, her body leaning slightly forward in silent solidarity. The deputies shifted uneasily, but Donnelly caught the look between man and dog, and for a moment something softened in his weathered features. "You're saying you'll help us?" It wasn't a question. Jack nodded once, firm and unflinching. "I've seen men hide behind machines in cruelty before. I won't let them do it here, not to these lives." His hand brushed against Rex's fur, steady and resolute. The sheriff exhaled slowly, then set the collar down on the counter. "All right," he said, his voice carrying both weight and resolve. "If you're willing, we'll need you. These bastards know the terrain, and they're careful. But they won't be expecting you, and they sure as hell won't be expecting her. He tilted his head toward Rex, who stood taller now, her ears pricked, her gaze sharp and unwavering. In that small clinic, surrounded by the hum of machines and the smell of antiseptic, an unspoken pact was formed. A battered Marine, a loyal shepherd, and a town ready to confront the shadows that had crept too close. Jack reached down, resting his palm against Rex's shoulder, feeling the steady strength beneath her fur. His voice was quiet, but sure. Then let's end this. The storm outside had broken, sunlight glinting faintly on the snowbanks. But inside the clinic, the weight of something far greater settled into place. The fight ahead would be dark, dangerous, and merciless. But for the first time in years, Jack felt his blood burn with purpose. And in Rex's steady eyes, he saw the same fire. The morning after the discovery in the veterinary clinic dawned bitterly cold, the sky a pale steel gray, as if the storm had left behind a warning instead of a farewell. Sheriff Donnelly's office buzzed with quiet urgency, radios crackling with updates as deputies mapped out the terrain. The blinking transmitter salvaged from the steel collar now pulsed on a monitor, its signal growing stronger the deeper they traced it into the heart of the forest. Jack stood near the window, arms crossed, his jaw set in the familiar stillness of a man preparing for battle. At his feet, Rex sat alert, her amber eyes fixed on the deputies, her ears flicking at each burst of static, as if she understood that the hunt was already underway. The convoy set out before noon, trucks rumbling through snow-packed roads, their tires biting into the frozen ground. Jack rode in the lead vehicle beside Sheriff Donnelly, the radio humming faintly as coordinates streamed in. Donnelly's weathered face was carved with focus, his mustache bristling as he chewed on the end of a pencil, while Jack sat in silence, staring through the windshield at the endless maze of pines. Rex sat upright in the back, her body tense but steady, every muscle quivering with anticipation. The forest seemed to close in as they turned off the main road, following a trail barely wide enough for a truck. The signal on the monitor blinked stronger, pulsing like a beacon leading them deeper into the dark. They disembarked at the edge of a clearing where the trucks could go no further, their breath frosting the air as they tightened coats and checked gear. Deputies fanned out with rifles slung across their backs, radios clipped to their jackets. Jack adjusted the strap of his old field pack, its weight familiar against his shoulders, and rested a hand briefly on Rex's head. "Easy, girl," he murmured, though his own pulse had already quickened. Sheriff Donnelly gave quiet orders, his deep voice carrying authority, then nodded toward Jack. "You're with me up front. That dog knows something we don't." Jack simply inclined his head, his eyes steady. Rex moved first, pressing her nose to the ground, then darting forward with sudden purpose. Her barks cut through the trees, sharp and urgent, signaling the trail. The deputies followed quickly, boots crunching in rhythm, their breath ragged against the biting cold. The deeper they pushed, the clearer the signs became. Trampled snow, faint drag marks, and eventually the metallic glint of wire half buried beneath drifts. One deputy swore under his breath as he uncovered a steel snare, its teeth wicked and rusted. "They've set traps everywhere," he muttered. Donnelly's face hardened, his hand tightening on his rifle. "Keep sharp, they're close." The clearing revealed itself abruptly, the trees opening to a crude encampment hidden between ridges. Smoke curled from the chimney of a shack patched with tarps and corrugated metal. Around, it stood rows of makeshift cages, some empty, others holding terrified animals whose eyes glowed in the shadows. The snow around the site was littered with footprints, crates, and lengths of chain. Rex stiffened, her fur bristling, then let out a bark so loud and piercing that every deputy froze for an instant. It was not a warning bark, but an alarm, a clarion call that shattered the stillness of the clearing. From the shack came the crash of movement, curses in rough voices, and the scrape of chairs. Men burst out into the snow, 3 of them dressed in ragged parkas and boots, faces gaunt and twisted by suspicion. One carried a shotgun, another a crowbar, while the third clutched a radio. For a heartbeat they hesitated, caught off guard by the sudden presence of armed officers in their hidden refuge. Then Rex charged forward, barking furiously, her paws pounding against the snow. The men flinched, and in that instant the deputies surged into motion, rifles raised, shouts echoing through the clearing. The criminals scrambled to react, but Rex's ferocity broke their rhythm. She darted left, cutting off the man with the shotgun, her growl vibrating like thunder in the frozen air. He faltered, his grip slipping, just as a deputy tackled him into the snow. The man with the crowbar swung wildly, but was quickly overwhelmed, 2 officers pinning him down. The last tried to flee, his boots slipping across the ice, but Jack was already moving. His stride was steady, his body coiled with years of discipline. He caught the man by the collar, wrenching him backward into the snow, the radio scattering from his hands. Jack's voice was cold and sharp. "It's over." Within minutes, the chaos quieted, the camp secured under the watch of deputies. The cages were pried open, frightened animals coaxed out into the snow, their tails tucked, but their bodies trembling with relief. Sheriff Donnelly stood in the center of the clearing, his breath heavy, his eyes scanning the pile of seized equipment. A deputy laid the evidence out, collars identical to the one Jack had cut from the pup, stacks of transmitters, spools of wire, and heavy iron cages. Donnelly spat into the snow, his voice a growl. They were building an arsenal of cruelty. Jack said nothing, but his jaw was tight, his fists clenched at his sides. Rex returned to him, her breath steaming, her amber eyes glowing with a fierce pride. By late afternoon, the trucks were loaded with evidence and prisoners. The cages stood empty, their cruel purpose ended. Snow began to lighten, flakes drifting lazily instead of in furious waves, and a pale sunlight broke through the clouds, painting the forest in soft gold. Jack stood at the edge of the clearing, watching as Rex sniffed the ground one last time before trotting back to his side. He knelt, scratching behind her ears, and for the first time in years, the corners of his mouth lifted into a faint, genuine smile. Back at the cabin, the fire roared, warm, the storm now only a memory. In the yard, Rex played with her 2 pups, both now stronger, their tiny bodies bounding clumsily through the snow. They tumbled and nipped at each other, their playful yelps filling the air like music. Jack stood on the porch, his hands tucked into his jacket, watching them with quiet contentment. The weariness in his eyes softened, replaced by something steadier. Purpose, anchored not in war or ghosts of the past, but in the fragile joy of life he had fought to protect. For the first time in a long time, Jack Carter felt that justice had not only been served, but that he too had found a new reason to stand tall. The story of Rex and her fragile pups reminds us that loyalty does not need words, that compassion is often shown in silence, and that true courage is found in the quiet sacrifices no one sees. Just as Rex trusted Jack in her darkest moment, so too can we trust that small acts of kindness ripple outward to heal a broken world. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave your thoughts in the comments and subscribe so you never miss the stories of silent heroes. May God bless you and keep you safe wherever you are.